encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Inside the Scholar's Study, where we discuss all things concerning scripture, faith, and scholarship. My name is Brad McNutton. If you're ready, we're going to go inside the Scholar's Study, and Dr. Gallagher is here with us today to discuss, first of all, the shirt that I'm wearing. I found out recently the alma mater of his parents.
That's right. That's where they met, fell in love, and eventually I am myself sort of a product of Ole Miss in that way.
I'm just saying it was a disappointing weekend for us, but I mean, we're Ole Miss.
Well, yeah. But I grew up in Kentucky, and
Yes.
it was not a disappointing weekend for that.
Oh, yes. Traitors. Just traitors. But anyway.
Yeah.
So New Testament textual criticism this season today.
Right.
Thinking about New Testament papyri.
Yeah, that's right. I think it was the previous episode. It's been a little while since we recorded, but I think the previous episode you asked a question about not New Testament manuscripts, but how many manuscripts do we have of things that are not the New Testament,
Right.
and I said Homer was the highest representative there as far as number of manuscripts. It turns out I think from the poking around I've done that I had a pretty good guess. I can't remember exactly what my guess was. Something like 2,000 or 2,500. I can't remember, but I think I maybe guessed 2,000. And as far as I can tell, that's pretty close to what the actual number is. So I just wanted to report on that I believe what I have found is that there are for manuscripts of Homer, and of course I'm talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey, there are something along the lines of 300 manuscripts, 350 maybe, medieval manuscripts. So this is like passing the text along down through the ages, and so we're talking about, from the year 1000 or something along those lines, later manuscripts, this continuous preservation of the text. And then also in more recent times, as New Testament papyri have been dug up in the sands of Egypt or wherever else, mostly in the sands of Egypt. Also, Homeric papyri have been dug up, and I think there is something along the lines of 1,500 or so papyri. These, of course, these are very fragmentary, and we're going to see in just a moment that the New Testament papyri often are also very fragmentary, but something along the lines of 1,500 papyri of Homer's works have been dug up in Egypt and maybe elsewhere. So, altogether, something close to 2,000.
So you're saying those were medieval.
The 300, 350 are the medieval ones. That's right.
Okay.
Right. And so
those are oldest. What is the oldest, and how does that match up against, say, the oldest of the?
Oh, well, of course, Homer himself is much earlier than Jesus. So we do have papyri for Homer that goes back before the time of Jesus.
Okay.
So again, I mean those medieval manuscripts, I mean, I don't know what the oldest of those are, but maybe about the year 1,000, something like that would be a pretty good guess. But as far as the papyri, there are papyri that go back 300 BC, something along these lines, or 3rd century BC. So yeah, anyway, pretty close to 2,000 for those. I pointed out the medieval because the medieval manuscripts of 300 or so, because those are going to be the ones that are more like extensive.
Right.
That I don't know if they're necessarily like complete copies of the Iliad, but they're going to be pretty close to that or extensive copies, whereas the papyri are going to be fragmentary. Not to say they're not helpful, but they're just not going to have a whole lot of text to them. But we'll take a look at the New Testament papyri here in just a second. We have talked in previous episodes about how there are something like, I think 5,300 manuscripts of the New Testament is a guess that an educated guess that I maybe mentioned. I have mentioned before in other contexts, maybe not on this podcast, getting towards 6,000. Maybe that's a bit of an overestimate. I don't know. I mean, again, it depends on how you count these things and what, um, even like what counts as a single manuscript or two manuscripts, or sometimes manuscripts are lost, and do we still count them? But then also manuscripts continue to be found. All right. So when we talk about, let's say 5,300 as a nice conservative estimate, maybe 5,000, as a nice conservative estimate for number of manuscripts of the New Testament. The vast majority of those, I think we saw this in a previous episode, the vast majority of those are going to be medieval themselves, late medieval, even 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. But some are going to go earlier than that. And unlike Homer, we do have basically complete copies of the New Testament from, the 4th century. So that would be an interesting comparison to make as well. But when we say 5,000 copies of manuscript copies of the New Testament, we do not mean 5,000 manuscript copies of the New Testament.
Right.
So some of those 5,000 actually do have Matthew through Revelation, but not many. I mean, did I mention this number? I think 7, something like that, is in my head as in terms of reasonably complete copies like that. So it's not a whole lot, Matthew through Revelation. Now, like I've just mentioned, we've got some probably 4th century copies that are basically that, or maybe at least one that is basically that, Matthew through Revelation. So pretty early, but most of the manuscripts, it's not just that they're fragmentary, it's that they were never intended to include the entire New Testament. Oftentimes they were never intended to include, even, a substantial portion of the New Testament. Sometimes, especially if you go back early, like 2nd and 3rd century, let's say 3rd century, 4th century, you might get manuscripts of just a single biblical book that might be fragmentary, but even in its original state, it probably only had, maybe a gospel, something like this. So 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, yeah, more or less, but understand that when we say that, we mean really it's like 2,500, 3,000, something like that, copies of the Gospels, and then, maybe, I don't know what, 1,500, 2,000 copies of Paul, and then a few hundred copies of Revelation, and that is the state of it. Now, even then, especially when you get to the early period, just like I mentioned for Homer, so also for the New Testament, those early manuscripts are usually pretty fragmentary. These early copies are on papyrus. I don't remember exactly what we've said about papyrus, but papyrus is a plant that ancient paper could be made out of this plant. You can get on YouTube and see how people both grow papyrus today. And I've seen videos, for instance, about how people have make sheets of papyrus. I've never done it myself, but I've seen people like they'll papyrus is it's a stalk, so it's sort of thin. So if you take a strip of it, it's not much. It's like a strip, maybe an inch wide or something like that. And then you lay it down. And then if you lay 10 strips next to each other, you get a nice size sheet. But then you're going to lay 10 other strips going the other way. And then it's got, it's a plant, so it's got some juice in it or something, it's moist when you first peel it. And then if you press it down, maybe you stick a rock on top of it or something, leave it for a few days, then those juices sort of bind together, and then you've got a sheet of papyrus. You want to dry it and maybe do some other things, and eventually you're going to use it for writing, get some ink and a pen and write on it. And so, it is durable, and we have some papyrus that's like 2,000 years old. It's been dug up, so that shows that it's sort of durable, but it's also less durable than animal skins. So, even the papyri, oftentimes the papyri that is dug up is very fragmentary. It has deteriorated. Of course, I mean, some of those papyri have been dug up in literally trash dumps.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and anything over the period of, say, close to 2,000 years,
yeah.
it's not going to be in just mint condition. Doesn't matter what it is, what kind of writing form it is.
Yeah, that's right. Let me point out a contrast with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were mostly on animal skin. Were there papyrus? I think there were papyrus, but it's not coming into my head right now how many or whether there were examples of papyrus among the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm thinking there were, but I just can't remember. But most of them were on animal skins, and some of those are like amazingly well preserved. A few. Yeah, I mean, probably listeners know about the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is basically the entire book of Isaiah from 2,000 years ago, all 66 chapters and all preserved. And there are some other really substantial scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls that have been preserved. Like I say, animal skin. And then a lot, when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls also, even though on animal skin, there's a lot of them that are just like, oh, really? That's what you're counting as a scroll? Okay. It's very poorly preserved. A lot of times that's what you get with these papyri as well. We'll see some pictures here in just a minute. I've got a document that I'm looking at right now, just my notes, and the very first line says, papyrus was the exclusive writing material used for ancient works until about 200 AD. It continued to be used into the 8th century. Let me just say that, like, on the surface of it, that first sentence is actually completely inaccurate. Papyrus was the exclusive writing material used for ancient works. Well, come on. I mean, the Babylonian literature was written on clay tablets. I just mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls were written on animal skins. So I think this is probably supposed to be about, like Greek and Latin literature, like the classical world. Maybe it's more accurate in that context. But in terms of, what we think of as the New Testament, early Christianity, probably it's pretty accurate along those lines that everything would have been papyrus until about 200 when animal skin started to be used. And then I think that next part is accurate. It continued to be used into the 8th century.
Okay, so let me ask you
Okay.
this. In 2 Timothy 4, when Paul asks for his books and the
Yeah.
parchment, I mean, that obviously shows, as you said, Dead Sea Scrolls, even before that, the
Right. Yeah, that's a
parchment
good
was being
point.
used. But uh, the books and the parchments, do you think that's a reference to sacred writings? Is there any way to know?
I mean, I don't think there's any way to know. I don't see how one could know that. I read recently in a book that said those parchments, somehow we can tell that those are codices.
Hmm.
I mean, this was like a major scholar, so somebody that I would he's a textual critic, New Testament textual critic. I'll say I don't quite understand how we're supposed. He didn't really explain it. He just sort of threw it out there as an obvious point. I don't see it myself. I mean, I'll grant. I mean, yes, maybe so, but I'm not sure what in the word or the context makes it so obvious that they are codices as opposed to scrolls, of
Right.
course. But in terms of like the material that they're made out of, I mean, he seems to specify these are animal skins, parchment, not papyrus documents. But yeah, as far as what the contents are, I think all we could do is guess at that. Um, let's see. So there are, I think I've mentioned before, there are something along the lines of 130 or so papyri that are registered in sort of the official database. We've looked at that website before. This is the INTF, which stands for basically new in English. It stands for a German thing, but it's German words. But in English, it's basically Institute for New Testament Textual Research. It's in Munster, right? Um, and so they register all these things. So something like 130 papyri have been registered. Of course, I mean, if you go back to like the year 1800, there are zero papyri. So all of these have been discovered. I mean, you go back to the year 1800, people did have manuscripts of the New Testament. And more were being discovered and cataloged and publicized, but no papyri. Um, let's see. I think I had written down, I'm not sure if I can find it here, when the first one was sort of publicized. I want to say Tischendorf. Konstantin von Tischendorf was this famous German textual critic, biblical scholar back in the 1800s. I'm not sure when he died, but let's say he died around the end of the 1800s. He published several critical editions of the New Testament in which he cataloged different readings of manuscripts. I want to say that this is a vague memory I have that he was the first one to actually record the reading of a papyrus, New Testament papyrus. So that, when the second half of the 1800s is when papyri were first beginning to be used. And then they really got discovered in larger numbers at the end of the 1800s. Oxyrhynchus that's the place where the trash dump in Egypt was discovered, where a lot of Greek documents, all kinds of stuff were discovered, including New Testament documents. And then in the 20th century, more and more papyri have come to light.
Okay, so another quick question about the papyri. Is it predominantly produced in Egypt or is it produced in other places as well?
Yeah, I mean, that I can only tell you what I've heard. I don't really know, but I've heard that yes, it was predominantly produced in Egypt. I'm not sure why. I mean, we can grow papyrus here in Alabama, so I'm not
Hmm.
sure why people wouldn't have grown it elsewhere. So that's why I think that's right. Certainly the most of the papyri have been discovered in Egypt, but that's always attributed to the dry climate and the sands and all that it preserves things a little bit better. But I don't see why, other places couldn't have. I mean, maybe the climate isn't right. I don't know, but
Hmm.
I
Well, I
do
was
know that you can grow papyrus in other places besides Egypt. So
I was kind of wondering if there's any connection to, ancient libraries, which many of them have been lost, but if there's any connection to, say, the Library at Alexandria, does that
yeah.
kind of connection to the amount of manuscripts that are maybe strode and scattered in different places or um
Mm, yeah. I mean, there is this story, and I don't know if people take this story seriously or not, but I think it's an ancient story that parchment is named for the city of Pergamum, and the king of Pergamum, and I forget the exact time period when this story was attributed to, but let's say it was sometime in the BC era. That the king of Pergamum wanted to build up his own library as a rival to the library at Alexandria. The Ptolemaic kings ran Egypt. They did this library at Alexandria. They had papyrus, growing all over the place. They had as much material as they wanted to make books, and they had this famous library. And the king of Pergamum wanted to imitate that, and so something. I'm getting the details. I'm going off memory here, but something along the lines of the Ptolemaic king of Egypt said, we're going to have an embargo on papyrus. We're not going to like let it go out of here. We're not going to trade with Pergamum and give them our papyrus to let them have this library that would rival ours. And so that's when the king of Pergamum, or whatever, the scholars in Pergamum, developed this other material that could be used for the production of books, parchment, animal skins. And of course, there's a whole way to make. Again, I've never done this myself, but you gotta like slaughter the animal and stretch it out and clean the flesh side and clean the hair side and let it dry and then cut it into proportions and then rule so it's a big process to take an animal skin, to take an animal and then start writing on its hide. It's not a thing you can do today. All right. Papyri. Yes. Okay. So this is Eldon J. Epp. He is he is a well-known New Testament textual critic. He says more than 1 million texts have been discovered on papyrus, of which about 80,000 have been published. So think about that. That means what, 900,000 plus have not been published. That was a statement he made in 2013. So that's 11 years ago. Probably hadn't changed a whole lot since then. And still relying on his figures here. And then we'll see some pictures. Let's see. In his day, this 2013, this is an article he published. There were 124 different papyri of the New Testament discovered. 62 of those, so half of them, come from the period before or close to 300 AD. So 300 AD, that is the cutoff point, because after that time, you're in the 4th century. You've got Christianity not only being legalized, but eventually becoming the state-sponsored religion. You've got so emperors promoting Christianity, and you've got books. You've got these manuscripts. I don't remember if we've talked about them. We will talk about them later, but Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, you've got these major copies of the entire Greek Bible in the 4th century. So if you say, let's look at what evidence we have pre-4th century. So that's why he has a cutoff at 300, the year 300, to make that the criterion. So 62 of these papyri come from before 300, and then he also says 5 majuscules, and then he lists off the 5 majuscules. Let me remind you what a majuscule is. Probably the majuscule is a style of handwriting. So if we're familiar with like fraternities and sororities and the capital Greek letters, or even mathematics and the capital Greek letters that we use in mathematics, the majuscules are written in that sort of Greek. That's an earlier form of Greek, as opposed to the cursive or the minuscule writing that came in the 9th century and later. Now, the papyri are also written on majuscules. It's just that we don't call them majuscules. We call them papyri to distinguish. So when we talk about majuscules, we mean the majuscules that are written on animal skins. So it's just a distinction that's made. So Epp points out that there are 5 majuscules also that come before 300 AD. All right, so 62 papyri, 5 majuscules, so a total of 67 manuscripts. This is the year 2013 that he's saying this. We got 67 manuscripts that come before the year 300. And then this next little bit, I'm pointing out how scrawny they are, how in a way disappointing. So 54 out of those 67, so that's 80%, have 1 or 2 leaves extant. So you're just looking at 1 leaf, which is like a page of a book, or 2. You either have 1 page or 2 pages, and that's it. That's all that's left. 5 of those 67 have 3 or 4 leaves. 3 of them have 9 to 11 leaves. And then 5 out of those 67 have more than 12 leaves. So those are the only ones that you would call like sort of substantial. And let me just read off what the 5 are. I'm sure our listeners are interested. What are those 5? These are the substantial manuscripts from before the year 300. P45, and we'll talk more about these in a little bit. P45 has 30 leaves. P46 has 86 leaves. P66 has 75 leaves. P72 has 95 leaves. And P75 has 50 leaves. So they are all pretty substantial. The least substantial is P45. Now, Brad, have you kept up with the time? How are we doing on our?
I haven't.
Oops.
Sorry.
Well,
I do have a question though about the
okay.
So I'm supposing, around the 400, that's when the papyri is kind of fading. So like the writings of the church fathers,
Oh,
what would they be on?
Yeah, you've caught me by surprise. I'll just take a guess that I suppose well, I don't know, even know how to guess. In 400, so we've got Jerome. I should know this. Jerome sitting in his monastery in Bethlehem, translating the Bible from Hebrew into Latin. What is the writing material that he writes on? I'm pretty sure it's parchment. I'm pretty sure. I again, it's a vague idea that I have in my head. I feel like I've read this. I feel like I've read it in Jerome himself, but I can't say it for sure. So yeah, that's what I think. All right, so let's take a look at some of these papyri. I said we would. Let me see if I can share my screen. Early New Testament manuscripts. So here are the ones. This PowerPoint is long. We won't go through it all, but we will get some idea. So P1, the very first one that is cataloged, you see it's a 3rd century. It's from Oxyrhynchus. It's a copy of part of Matthew chapter 1, and it's 1 sheet. And the 1 sheet that it is, it's got some holes in it. But oftentimes that is what your papyrus manuscripts are going to look like. So when I say you've got 5,300 copies, 5,300 copies of the New Testament, P1 counts as one of those copies. Right? So just recognize it's actually not a copy of the New Testament. It's not even a copy of the Gospels. It's not even a copy of Matthew. It's a copy of part of Matthew chapter 1. That's what you're actually looking at. So just be aware of what the numbers mean when we say 5,300 copies.
Right. Don't overstate the case.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So P4, I couldn't find a picture of that one. That one has 6 leaves, as you see. Here's one. P5, 3rd century, some of John. So this, what we see here, it can't be the entirety of it. Because it's got John 1 through, 20, basically. So that one might be a little more substantial. P7. This is P9. This is the one fragment of P9. So that's it. It's got a little bit of First John in there. All right. Let's look at some of these more substantial ones. I'm going to fast forward through a lot of these and go to P45. So this is part of the Chester Beatty Papyri in Dublin. And the Chester Beatty Papyri, we've got P45, P46, P47. These are, more or less 3rd century papyri, and they are substantial. So P45, 3rd century, originally had 112 leaves. So 27% of it is preserved. Portions of the Gospels and Acts, as you see. Let's see. The Western order of the Gospels. So you see Matthew, John, Luke, Mark, and then Acts. That's the order that it's in, the so-called Western order of the Gospels, instead of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that's a substantial one. P46 is Paul's letters. This one is from about the year 200, something like that. It's usually dated to then. And you see it's also mostly in Dublin. We can go to images. Let's see, where does the images take us? Okay, I think I've mentioned this website before, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, which has images of quite a number of manuscripts. So if you want some images of P46, go there. Let's go back. Okay, so I've just highlighted here that we have Romans, and then after Romans we have Hebrews. So that's an interesting order. And then we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then Ephesians before Galatians, Philippians, Colossians. And of course, we don't have 2nd Thessalonians or anything that comes later. So no Philemon, no pastoral epistles, no 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. So it has been debated about what the significance of that is for issues of canon, for instance, or even could P46 have originally contained all those letters? And I think it's debated. All right. So let's scoot on to P66. There you get a nice picture of it. 75 leaves. Again, about the year 200, preserving John chapter 1 through 15 or so, or chapter 20. Some of that, 21 even. All right. That's P66. P72 is another one of these larger ones. Bodmer. And we see P72 has an interesting assortment of contents. The Protevangelium of James, which is sort of a gospel of, it's a protevangelium. So evangelium is gospel. So this is an early gospel. So it's a pre-Jesus gospel. It's an account of before Jesus was born. It's an account of Mary. In other words, Mary, how she became pregnant, what it was like for her. I think most people would say this. It's completely made up. We don't have to take it seriously in terms of historical record. It's let's call it a thought experiment. What would it have been like for Mary during those 9 months or whatever? And so a proto-evangelium. I mean, it's an interesting text. Third Corinthians, of course, in our Bibles, we have First and Second Corinthians. Third Corinthians is a another document that was written later. The Odes of Solomon is a collection of poetry. So apparently, this manuscript has the 11th of those poems. But then we also have the Epistle of Jude, and we have First and Second Peter. But in between those, we have a patristic work, Miletos on Pascha, which is like Passover. It's a Easter sermon, basically, and then a hymn. So interesting. We've got some apocrypha, some early Christian writings. What does this suggest about, well, why in the world was this collection made? What does that tell us about about the status of Jude or First and Second Peter? What does that tell us about the status of the Proto-Evangelium of James and Third Corinthians? I mean, those are questions that are obviously going to have different answers depending on, who you ask. But certainly an interesting manuscript. And then, yeah, P75 is the last one we'll look at. Well, we should look at P52 as well. I feel like we're probably over time already, but P75, early 3rd century. We got 50 leaves, Luke and John. And this one actually preserves the transition, which I find pretty interesting, the transition between Luke and John. And you can see it on at the end of the Gospel of Luke here, and it says Evangelion kata Lukon, so Gospel according to Luke, and then Evangelion. Does that say kata Ioannein? I think it does. Kata Ioannein. So Gospel according to John there. So you've got a title for Luke at the end of the Luke's Gospel, probably at the beginning of it as well. We just don't have that part. And then you've got the transition, and then later in the same column on the same sheet, John begins.
Were there any manuscripts or listings where like Luke and Acts were back to back or together? I guess you might say.
No. Yeah, I mean that is interesting, especially because like these days, modern scholars just like as a matter of course talk about Luke Acts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the big theory is that it was a 2-volume work. They'll talk about Luke Acts as in a hyphenated way. So not even like, like Acts was a sequel or anything like that. Like it came like Luke had the idea of writing Acts later after publishing his gospel, and oh, what a big success my gospel was. I think I'll take advantage of this market and write another book. It wasn't that at all. I mean, according to this theory, according to the theory, he wrote it as, I'm going to start with, the birth of John the Baptist, and I'm going to tell the story up till the imprisonment of Paul in Rome. So this, from the beginning, he planned it out as this 2-volume work. But our manuscripts don't seem to care about that at all. Luke is always like one of the gospels, it's with the other gospels, and Acts is its own thing. All right. Let me go back and catch P52 real quick. This one is famous. It is tiny, as you see on the screen. It is famous because it has long been thought to be the earliest portion, the earliest scrap, I'll say, of any bit of the New Testament. And that is very possibly true. I will say that Brent Nongbre published an article about 20 years ago in the Harvard Theological Review in which he tried to say, do we really know that? And, it's how would we know? Like, it has often been dated to like almost specifically the year 125. Look, dating it to the year 125 is sort of silly. We cannot possibly be that specific in our dating of the manuscript. How are manuscripts dated? I've mentioned this before. It's the handwriting, as Nongbre points out in his article. We just can't be that specific when we're using handwriting to date these things. We've got to do something more like, this 100-year period is when it likely came from, something like this. So, 2nd century, maybe even second, early 3rd century, something like that. Like I say, it has often been like even New Testament textual critics has often thought, P52 is from 125 AD. But that was, like I say, just overly specific. So 2nd century would make sense. Even so, I mean, as you see, it's a bit disappointing of a fragment. It's early, and that's great. Doesn't have a whole lot of stuff on it. So, it'd be nice if there were more to it. But that's often the case with these early fragments, as we have seen. There are some substantial copies, especially about the year 200 or maybe a little bit later, P46, P66, and others. But most of these early papyri are pretty fragmentary. Although, I mean, it's great to have them because they get us back closer to the time of the New Testament. They contain readings that are helpful to us, confirm some readings, introduce new ones. So I'm not trying to down them, but we do need to recognize what we actually have.
Right. And not just overstate the case. I mean, there are dangers in overstating the case. And I can even argue that overstating the case on some of these things can actually set people up for their faith to be hurt.
Yeah.
When they encounter and they realize, oh, wait, that's not as specific. You can't actually know that as for certain.
Yeah.
And as if somebody had just simply reasoned with them in the beginning and said, here's what we have. This is what we think. But this is why it's okay. In essence, you start questioning all the underpinnings of things. And so being more specific and more nuanced, I think, in time, especially in today's culture, with Google and everything at your fingertips, somebody can, in 2 seconds, call up something that you'll find something that will question you. So,
yeah, that's right. That's right. So, yeah, like I could imagine people saying, we have a copy of the Gospel of John from the year 125, which I can understand how somebody could say such a thing, but copy of the Gospel of John, bit overstated. From the year 125, definitely overstated. So yeah, just as you're saying, be more careful and nuanced.
Right. All right. Well, we want to remind you that episodes are released each and every Wednesday. You can find them on our website at thelightnetwork.tv. Social media platforms where the Light Network is will alert you to their release. You can, of course, on podcasting platforms, like, subscribe, follow, whatever it's called these days. And then also on YouTube, especially with this season, we've started with YouTube and with a number of manuscripts and different things where the video version would be advantageous to you with what we're looking at this particular season. So on YouTube, you can go there and see it. You can subscribe to it and be alerted when new episodes are released. You can also email us at scholars@thelightnetwork.tv. We've always enjoyed that interaction. Look forward to some more in the future. But we're grateful that you were with us today, and we'll meet you next week as we go back inside the Scholar's Study.